Have you ever wondered how to optimize DEI? You might also be wondering what this has to do with HR. That illustrates the many facets of DEI and how to bridge the gap. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation has many of you buzzing for more. I am looking forward to you meeting my guest today. We value your feedback. Drop them in the chat or in the comment boxes on social media. We intend to respond to as many comments as possible. This takes a great effort to pull off, so I'm eternally grateful to all my loyal guests. Follow us. Diversity Connects Us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Anchor, and all the other podcast directories. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and EQ coach and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase the books will be in the comments. For a living, I help organizations implement DEI plans, help them reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. Join us as we share the different voices in the DEI space. Here today with us is Donald Knight. Thank you, Donald, for joining us today. What a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Rochelle. It's an honor. I've been able to see and listen to a few episodes prior to us meeting today, and just the work that you're doing. I just want to say thank you. Like, creating space for people to have these types of conversations are so important, and I think from a representation perspective, being able to have this type of a media outlet as a leave behind for generations who will soon come and become leaders after us, somewhat provides them as a North Star of the types of impact and conversations that they can have. So truly, I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's interesting you said that. I had a question that I posed a friend of mine, and I said, "What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?" And she spoke of her legacy, and that's exactly what I said. My legacy is for, for people, for generations after me to have something to listen to and to aspire to, so
Yeah.
they can feel represented in the space.
Yeah. No, that's you are living that legacy right now. So kudos to you.
Oh, thank you. If you want to tell the audience a little bit more about you and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Donald Knight. So my parents named me. The first thing I would tell you is that I'm Dalen's dad. I'm very excited to be a father. And my son is 11. He'll be 12 soon. I also am a very proud husband to my wife, Ashley. And like, more importantly, like I tell people, uh, the role that I get to do every day is at the intersection of the things that I like to do and the things that I'm good at, which is I'm really good at people. I like people. I've spent a lot of time with so many different cultures just based on my upbringing and my parents being military. And so I get to do that. And the things that I'm really, really good at is like helping unlock people's potential. And so, as chief people officer for Greenhouse Software, I get to wake up every day and really focus on two things, which is how do I hire amazing people so they can unlock their potential and do the best work of their lives? And then the second thing I get to do is like eliminate any barriers that come in their way, preventing them from being as successful. Those are the two things I get to do every morning. And it's part of the reason why you and I are speaking today. So I'm super excited to be here. That's me in a nutshell.
Oh, that's awesome. We're gonna switch it up because you
Okay.
just, yep. I love what you said, and you said you unlock people's potential. How do you go about unlocking people's potential?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the first thing you have to do is be able to um, recognize things through a global lens. So, like, you call this diversity connects us. I truly agree with that. Having lived in three different countries, six different states before the age of 14, I got to be able to see so many different cultures. And what I found is like, for the most part, like, we may have different languages, we may have different favorite foods. Some people like sports, some people don't. But the one thing that like connects all of us is this idea of like community. And like, there's an HBR article that came out that actually said the number one driver of happiness is not money, it's not title, it's community. And part of the way that you unlock potential with people is inviting them, seeing their differences, but inviting them to be a part of your community. And so for me, that means building proximity with people. And so like I'm really, really, really good at it. And so I seek to build proximity with people. Um, what that does for me is it allows me to see them at a much deeper level than they might have shared with just a passerby. So like one of the things I like to do is like if somebody says good morning, like I like say bad morning, and it catches them off guard because they're so used to saying it routine. Um, and but that's just a way that I invite people to the community. Once you see people, what you can do is then after building proximity with them is connect the dots on the type of impact that they want to make. I call it purpose highway. So like just living life on purpose, you're clearly doing that. You're living life on purpose. And the idea there is in like, how do I help them get to where they're going on their highway? And we may be going in different directions, but we're all on the same highway. And so the idea is like, how do I help or assist them and getting to their location of choice. So I'm very big on building proximity, and I host proximity sessions normally with a scoop of ice cream because I believe ice cream is a universal language.
Is the universal energy? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's a universal energy and language. It's like one of those things like ice cream, music. There's certain things that transcend culture, and it creates this opportunity to have a bridge. And so for me, that's very big.
Oh, I can't tell my daughter that. How do you build proximity? How is it that you build proximity? Is there a language that you use? Is, oftentimes on this podcast, we talk about emotional intelligence as well and inclusive leadership. So how is it that you build this proximity?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the ways that I'm able to like build proximity with people is like really practicing like active inclusion. So active inclusion for me is like I believe inclusion happens when diversity, equity, and allyship are present. And so one of the ways that I do that is I try to figure out like, okay, I recognize differences on a surface level, but like let's connect deeper than that. Like how can we have vulnerable conversation where I can understand people on a different level, and even looking for ways that we are connected with one another, like trying to figure out like you have family, I have family, you're a parent, I'm a parent. I have found that has been an easier way to be able to connect or build bridges with people.
Right. So you bridge the gap, basically.
Absolutely, like bridging that gap is super super important.
Right. And when we go back to language, is there a language? I know you said that, there is ice cream transcends everything and it helps people just soften up a little bit, pardon the pun, because ice cream is so soft and then you have all these different flavors. Does that remove the barrier before people come up or you have a conversation with them? Do they feel more comfortable?
Absolutely, like I think comfort comes from people being able to see synergies or similarities with other people. And for me, things like ice cream, like everybody who doesn't enjoy a scoop of ice cream, even people that are like lactate intolerant or lactose intolerant, like they find like a sorbet or something similar. But the idea there is like, hey, people's defenses are typically always at an all-time high. The
Yes.
idea is like, how do I create some level of similarity? How do I create some level of a bridge where we can bring those defenses down and be able to connect with one another on a deeper level?
Right. You mentioned that you lived and worked abroad and excelled in finding or optimizing talent on a global level. Could you let our listeners know how you did that?
Yeah, so by having parents that were in the military, I often find myself in cultures that were not American,
Mhm.
legitimately, living in places like Germany or short stints in places like Italy. And what I found is in those moments that um, our cultures are, for the most part, very similar, but also very different. Like they have an emphasis on family. They want to do well in life as well. But like, how do they spend time with one another? What does a meal even look like with someone else as part of their family? Um, and it was in those moments that for me, I feel like my lens was shaped globally. Like I didn't realize it in the moment, but as I got older and my parents retired in America, what I realized is like, oh, like not everybody was afforded the same opportunity. Um, and so like it took a chief human resource officer really pointing out to me that, hey, Donald, this is a skill set, like you default to allyship type behaviors. Um, why do you do that? And I was like, well, I mean, I've just been in these places where you had to, like, I don't, that's how I made friends. That's how I connected with other people, is like being like a protector or being a bridge or really valuing someone else's differences. And how that is translated in business for me is like, now as a chief people officer, like allyship is super important, because like during the pandemic, like we realized that people with disabilities have been telling companies they can work from home for years. And it wasn't until able-bodied people went home. Now for me, it's like, how do I create even more bridges or build even more proximity with people with disabilities as an ally? How do I make sure that captions are turned on? How do I make sure that my pronouns are present? Like, how do I create spaces for them to be celebrated? And so like those types of allyship behaviors, I think, were honed because my parents moved around so much and I had close proximity to different culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. How do you ensure employees remain diverse, equitable, and included?
Yeah, it's a great question as well. I think number one, it's baked into our hiring process. So we believe in structured interviewing, and we have software that helps that. And the reason why is our founders understood on the front end that if you want to improve inclusion later in a business through like the promotion process or even leadership succession slates, it actually starts in the hiring process. If you don't hire diverse people, you can't promote diverse people. Like it's very difficult. Um, for us though, it's we have workforce diversity goals that we have that like serve as like our guideposts as to like how are we making sure that as we grow and as we scale, that the full fabric of our community is represented in leadership. So I'm excited. Like when I got here, we had two women leaders inside of our executive leadership team. Now we have four. Like I'm very excited about that. Well, the other thing that we're doing is like we ensure beyond those workforce diversity goals is our employee resource groups. We've rebranded those arbors, and it's almost like this idea of like an arbor creates a safe space for plants to grow and bloom.
Hmm.
We do that for our employees, and the thought process there is that um, how are we intentional in our employee resource groups by giving them the development that they need, and being very intentional around things like mentoring. So
Mm.
that's how I think that we've been able to curate that. Now, I'll be honest with you, Rochelle, it's not a finish line. Like this work um, will continue to have to be done, but I do feel comfortable where we are today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you say in the hiring process, you are hiring diverse people, but in that hiring process, you're also hiring people with diverse perspectives and diverse skills. And I understand that, it's a software company. How is it that you can how is it what is the process to be able to hire diverse people? What is it that you're using to be able to legitimately put a number and say, this is how many diverse people with diverse perspectives we actually have?
Absolutely. So first, I think it starts with the software. If you don't have diverse engineers making a product, 9 times out of 10, there's a great chance that it's going to be bias built into the product because it's reflecting the hands that created it. And so our engineers are rather diverse, and our head of product is a Asian American. And so, like those types of things, I think on the front end ensures that the tools or the software being used um, has a diversity of thought being baked into it.
Mm.
Later on though, I would say is like we have very specific goals for VP plus, for director plus, for people leaders, for experts, which most people call individual contributors. Like we're very intentional around what are our percentages, and it's not percentages on the back end. That's a checklist. Like to me, that's performative diversity. I'm talking about like how are you ensuring that your candidate pool is diverse? How many of them are actually making it to the on-site stage? How many of those people are making it to the offer stage? When we see a blockage in the pipeline, we need to do some greater conversations with our head of TPNA, who's also an Asian American woman, who can say, oh no, like the reason why there's blockage is like right now that person was promoted internally or we repurposed them for a different role. But like if you don't what gets measured gets changed. So I
Mm,
always have a allergic reaction, if you will, when people say, well, like, we can't do this work. And I'm like, no, like, you report financial numbers, right? We monitor financial numbers. Most people know what's EBITDA, or like what's your revenue, or what's your profit loss statement look like. The same thing should be done for people. And if you want to create an inclusive workplace where you have diversity of thought, you have to actually have goals centered on those things that allow people to actually see a company making strides to achieve them.
absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Christopher E. Lopez Sr., thank you so much for joining in. He says, way to change the dynamics of how we work and provide people services for organizations.
Yeah, Christopher, I don't know you personally, but I really appreciate that. The, the landscape that we have today is, in my opinion, the gold rush of people teams or HR teams. And so the dynamics have to change in order for us to be able to create an environment for tomorrow's leaders. So, yes, kudos to Christopher for noticing that.
Absolutely. And so we probably touched upon this a little bit. How do you attract and retain? I think more importantly, retain the diverse talent.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm reminded of an article that came out from um, the World Economic Forum, which basically said that it would take almost like 200 years for there to be compensation parity between men and women in the workplace.
Mm,
Um, and like, I remember just like reading that article and having like a legit allergic reaction to, like, first of all, why would it take 200 years? And like, are we okay with that? Like, as business leaders, are we okay with that? I think it starts with you centered the question primarily on like not just attracting, but the retention. Part of the retention story that companies have to have is like, how are you intentional in those in development? Because what we found is, when you look at like tons of companies in the aggregate, they had women leaders, but there was a threshold that they could not see greater representation. And in my opinion, it had nothing to necessarily do with skill set, and more to do with how intentional were those organizations in curating an environment where those people could also thrive. And so for me, the retention for me is like, we hired a vice president of development and business partners who will be completely focused on how do we create curricula that allows the full fabric of our community inside of Greenhouse, regardless of your background, to also be deposited in the necessary expertise, the necessary experiences, the necessary skill in order for them to become the leaders that we need for tomorrow. And to me, like, if companies are not making that level of investment, um, they're essentially signing up to say that we want to retain people, but we don't want to see diversity in some of the highest levels of the organization. The other thing I would say is, like, we should not overlook the impact of representation. And so, like, part of the way that we retain people is making sure that they have illustrations of what they could be by having
mm,
diverse leaders. And so for me, I'm excited because at Greenhouse we can say that our audit chair for our board um, is an Asian American woman. We have 3 women on our board. We have 4 women that are in our C-suite, and just the power of that representation alone serves as almost like a pathway where other talent can see these footprints that have been laid before them, because these young ladies have charted a course that allows them to say, oh no, I want to stay at this organization and grow. And oh, by the way, it's not limited to just women. African Americans, people in the LGBTQ plus community, also people that are in the Latinx community. All of these communities, representation is very, very important, but it starts with how do you develop those folks? And the easiest way to develop them is starting in the hiring process.
absolutely. Absolutely. And what makes Greenhouse so exceptionally, I can't even find the words, open to not having just to check the box at the end of the day for DEI? What was their business model? And is that, I think that's a business model everybody should emulate. to be honest, and especially in software, because that's where it starts. It starts in the software system and the hiring system and the artificial intelligence, right? What is it that made it such a actually they're taking care of the people first. That's what's happening in Greenhouse. They're taking care of the people first.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I feel like our CMO Karen Van Buren would really appreciate you saying that. We are a people first company. And when people ask me, like, Donald, like, what's the difference between people first as opposed to signs of people that are not people first? For me, it's like this idea of like genuinely being inclusive as opposed to like performative diversity. Or are you a company that you see representations at all levels of the organization, or is it limited to just junior roles? Um, those are side effects or symptoms or signs of people first culture. And I think the reason why it's so open here is because um, our founders, that's what they stacked hands on. Like when they went to
Mm,
create a company, they had worked at other businesses. The hiring process was not easy, and it was very flawed from an inclusive perspective. And so
mm,
they sought to not only create this software that allows or enables that to happen, but like we maintain and nurture our culture very dutifully. Um, and so, like prior to me talking to you, we had our last AMA, our Ask Me Anythings, where we allow the organization to literally ask us the tough questions, and we answer them openly. So to me, I think it's like the culture is nurtured in that regard, and therefore it is remained. I think the other thing is like for many companies, values are things that you put on a wall, and so many companies are struggling with trying to get attracting candidates because they're like, why won't they join us? Well, the reason they won't join is they've talked to people at your organization. They found out that you're catfishing people. Like you're not living up to these values. For us, our values are centered on purpose, entrepreneurship, and belonging. And when people feel like they don't belong at Greenhouse, we encourage them to elevate that. And we have a speak up culture where then we can go address like, why is that the case? And I
mm,
think that's where you've seen, or I've seen at least, people recognize that, oh no, like this is the real deal. I was talking to one of our newest leaders, and she said, I joined, I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like I've been waiting for it to not actually be what you all said it was. When is that going to drop? And I was like, listen, I've been here 268 days. That shoe is never going to drop. Like this is the real deal. Um, I call it, from a branding perspective, I call it oxygen in the room. And I've seen
mm,
what happens when people are in suffocating environments. Um,
mm,
and it's a struggle because some people are forced to be in those suffocating environments because their families depend on them financially,
mm,
or one of their spouses have fallen on hard times, like with layoffs or furloughs. And it sucks to see people struggling in those environments. Equally, at the same time, I recognize the responsibility of trying to illustrate to some other companies what it looks like to have oxygen in the room.
mm.
And for us, our talent, they truly say that there's oxygen in the room. And so that's the goal, is like creating a space where everyone can breathe, not someone who's just super close to the founders or someone of one specific ethnicity, but making sure the full fabric of Greenhouse can breathe. So
Absolutely. I love that. There's a LinkedIn user here that says diversity of thought only happens with actual diverse people.
couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Christopher E, thank you again for your great comments. So here he says the great resignation has played a part into how retention is thought of, especially in the diversity. How are you explaining to talent not to leave an organization during the storm? If they weather the storm, you are more marketable to the organization relating to leveling up. I
Christopher,
know.
Christopher, I might need to like personally invite you to like every speaking opportunity. You have some very thoughtful questions. Um, I think the first one though I would have to say is I want to decouple that, which is how are we explaining to talent not to leave the organization in the middle of the storm? The first thing I would say is we're not. Um, We recognize at Greenhouse that while people are here under our care, that we are developing and grooming people first leaders who will grow and bloom into roles outside of the greenhouse. We recognize that. And one of the things that I'm encouraged by is that we don't take that lightly. In fact, our hope is that we were able to plant other people first leaders in other companies and cultures where you will see something transformative about that particular leader that then somewhat influences shifting that culture more towards being people first, or by amplifying the people first culture that's already present at that organization. So we're not trying to tell talent they shouldn't leave in the middle of the storm. Um, Me joining Greenhouse, I joined in the middle of this macroeconomic storm. To the question around like, will they be more marketable to the organization and leveling up? I think that's also a great question, Christopher. My thought process there is loyalty alone should not make someone more marketable to their organization. It should be their impact and their contributions. And I think for so long, diverse groups have struggled in growing in their careers because they have been told that you have to serve a minimum requirement to be demonstrated as loyal or um, uh, someone who wants to grow their career at one specific company. And I think for me, I reject those notions. It should be focused on impact. And how
Mm,
do you play nicely in the sandbox? And do you demonstrate inclusive behaviors? Um, those are the things that we hope will help people level up, not simply tenure or choosing to stay in the middle of a storm. So I think it's a great question. I wish I would have planted it myself, but I do view those things a little differently. And I know a number of leaders who would join me in that perspective.
absolutely. I love that. There's a LinkedIn user here, Tammy Triolo. She says a good leader is about elevating people to their highest potential, even if that potential is outside of the organization. Because you know
Tammy,
what happens? They're going to bring that potential somewhere else. So you're actually right. You're actually planting the seed and
yep,
you're allowing them to sow somewhere else so they can bring all that amazing good energy there too.
totally agree with you. Totally agree with Tammy. Ditto underscore retweet. Um, People first leaders want to elevate people. They want people to unlock their potential, their highest potential. They want people to do the best work of their lives, meaningful work. And if that means that they have grown into a role that's outside of the organization, we don't frown, we cheer that they have found the next tour of duty, if you will, where they can create significant impact. So, Tammy, I don't know you personally, but I totally agree with you and Rochelle in that regard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How do you think you would align people strategies to business objectives?
Give me an illustration. What do you mean?
So when you're aligning, strategies within an organization, and the business already has objectives that they have to meet, how do you bridge the two?
Yeah, I think all people objectives or strategies should be linked to a business imperative. We don't even like from a development perspective, like we develop people because we know that we need leaders for tomorrow. The business imperative is, do we have readiness for leadership? Um, Everything that we do from a people perspective should be linked to a business imperative. And so the way that I'm able to ensure that is like at our organization, we're on a quarterly cadence. First quarter, we talk about people or talent. Second quarter, we talk about long-term strategy. Third quarter, we talk about short-term strategy. Fourth quarter, we do the budget. And that people strategy should be influencing what that long-term or short-term strategy is because it's linked directly to a people imperative. So said differently, I don't think you have a solid or thoughtful people strategy that's not linked to the business.
Right. Absolutely. Tammy again has a question. Thank you so much, Tammy, for joining in. She's got great questions as well. She says, how you help people exit out of the organization is just as important as how you welcome them in.
Tammy, my grandfather would give you a huge hug right now. He used to tell us that the only thing more important than the first impression is the last impression. And so often when people are exiting an organization, um, we use that as an opportunity to make the wrong last impression. And
Mm.
unfortunately, then they leave and they share that last impression with others. And so, at least at Greenhouse, not only do we prioritize hiring and onboarding, but we also prioritize offboarding. And our thought process is that person may very well end up sitting in an organization that the organization is choosing what hiring software they're going to go with. We want to give them every opportunity to be able to say positive things about Greenhouse. And that starts with what kind of experience do they have? So we stood up a team called People Experience that's focused on when people experience Greenhouse, what do they experience? Not just while they're here, but also while they're exiting. And the goal there is to be crystal clear, is to create these types of experience or these moments that people can not only be excited about, but hopefully great impactful moments that they're willing to share with others that attract others.
Absolutely. That's absolutely. I love all of it. How do you develop diverse diverse leaders?
Differently, everybody has
Mm.
different needs. And so we have to be very intentional in curating development that is tailored to different audiences. What I have found is if you try to choose a one size fits all approach, you will find that some people will thrive in that approach and others won't. And it's
Mm.
not a reflection of aptitude or competency, but more reflective of development that has been tailored to people and their strengths and their learning styles. Um, and so, the same way I wouldn't give a conductor a a rolling pin, and I wouldn't give a chef a conductor wand. Um, you have to tailor that development. For us, what we've been trying to do is like uncover through things like focus groups. So our idea team, there's a young lady named Nia Darvel who leads these focus groups, and she somewhat helps us unpack what that may look like for different demographic groups. And then
Mm.
that helps aid what our VP of development can then go out and build for different cohorts. The
Mm.
beautiful thing that we've learned or uncovered is psychological safety is important, and these safe spaces are important. And where people feel unsafe, they can't retain development. Um, no matter how intentional it was, you have to be able to you have to be able to curate um, intentional development for them by making sure that the psychological safety is first present.
Absolutely. How absolutely. And does the ERG provide, obviously it provides that for them as well. And I think you mentioned something earlier. I might have missed it. You said you have there's a session where everybody speaks up or speaks out.
Yeah, so the our idea team served as a feedback loop, but the Ask Me Anything's AMAs, they serve as a feedback loop. We also practice radical candor, where leaders will meet with a skip level, so not their directs, but directs of their directs, and they anonymize that feedback in order to provide the people leader or the hiring manager with greater insights on what they can be doing differently to create greater impact for their teams. And we practice that all the way up to the CEO. So doing so, um, just again, it's just another illustration of how we nurture our culture rather dutifully.
Absolutely. It's amazing, when we think of everything really revolves around the top trickling down, because that's how everybody is represented, is by what is being fed from the top. And it seems like you do a great, Greenhouse does a great job at doing that. How would you power up this partnership between DEI and HR? And I know we touched upon it a little bit at the beginning of the show. How would you power up this partnership?
Yeah. One thing I would say though is I actually don't think at Greenhouse it's a trickle down. I think our leaders recognize that we work for them. Like our CEO will tell you, like he didn't close a deal in the last 60 days. The experts are doing that. The people that are
Mm.
AEs and AMs and SDRs. Um, he's not the person making certain financial decisions. Those are people on our FP&A team. So for
Mm,
us, it's actually an inverted triangle where we feel like our leaders, as leaders, we work for them. And so since we work for them, how do we create conditions or environments in order for them to thrive? That's what's most important. So I think it's more foundational than a trickle down. As it
right.
relates to the pairing of DE&I and HR, or for us, the idea team and the people team, we have a phenomenal leader in Jamie Adasi. And there's two things I would say there. One for me, and then I'll say one that I've learned from Jamie. The one that comes from me is that ideas should be baked in everything. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and allyship should be baked in everything that we do. It's not a checklist. It's not a checkbox. For companies that are people first, you have to be baked. It has to be baked in. So like things like return to office, I can tell that return to office did not have an idea lens for many companies, because if
Hmm.
it did, they would have realized people with disabilities thrived during the pandemic. The other thing that we realized is that working moms, thrived in the pandemic. And so this idea of forcing people to go back to the office is actually it might have good intentions, but has bad execution because it doesn't have an idea lens to it. The second thing that I would say that I learned from Jamie Adasi is the importance of support. And businesses have to support, for us, idea or D&I efforts. Those things are super important. If you're not supporting those teams, and I don't mean support with lip service, I mean support with tangible dollars, relationships, having the right tools, giving them the right opportunities and platforms to create the impact needed. If we're not doing that, then it's going to fall on deaf ears.
Right. Absolutely. There are two questions I have here, or two comments. First, Tammy says, "Please remove everything wholly. Please, for everything wholly, remove DI from under HR." What would you say to that?
I think I understand what Tammy is saying. Um, I think what she is saying is, and I don't want to put words in Tammy's mouth because I've never met her, but I think what she is saying is that for so long, DE&I has not received the support needed in order to be as impactful, because it has sat underneath HR leaders who have not seen the prioritization or the impact that those teams can make. And so I think as a result, what ends up happening is they don't receive the support needed. At least for our teams, like if you go talk to Jamie Adasi, like idea does sit underneath the people team. And one of my favorite things that she's told me, and she says she feels more supported now than she's probably ever been in her career. So I don't think it's reflective of where the team sits. I think it's reflective of the leader that they're supposed to have as a shepherd, helping them create
Mm,
impact. If you have the wrong shepherd, the flock will tell. And so you have to be able to make sure that regardless of where it sits, I have friends that report directly to the CEO and their DE&I leaders, and they struggle because there's no oxygen in the room.
mm.
In that regard, they have the wrong shepherd, or the shepherd could be navigating life a little differently. So
Differently.
I think it's
Absolutely.
more about that as opposed to reporting structure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Christopher, again, he says here, are your ERG part of the business strategy? Do leaders, you want to do one question at a time? He's got a lot of good questions, Christopher. So, are your ERG part of the business strategy?
Yes, our arbors, we call ours arbors. I know companies like Salesforce calls theirs Ohanas, but our arbors are part of our business strategy, absolutely. And it's also part of our annual OKR. So when we talk about our objectives and key results, our workforce diversity goals are baked in there. It is a business imperative. So yes.
Yes. And he asks, do leaders ask the groups to give ideas for business opportunities, making them more of a BERG, business employee resources group?
Not, that's a great question. Not only do our leaders ask, all of our arbors have executive leadership representation as the executive sponsor. So our ELT is active. That's another sign of a people first culture is if your executives tell you that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, and then you go to the highest points of the organization and you don't see active participation, well, there might be an opportunity there. At least here at the highest levels of our organization, our executive sponsors are active members and active participants of such arbors, and thusly, yes, create a direct feedback loop. We're also in a unique position because it's hiring software, right? So we recognize if we want to continue to help other companies um, create impact in their diverse hiring, well, we should be listening to our diverse employees to help us um, influence that product roadmap. So, yes.
Absolutely. I love that. There are so many more questions, but I want you to leave us maybe for a second part because this conversation could be we can continue going for quite a while. What would be your parting words today, Donald, for the for all our listeners today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, the one thing I would say is three things. Start with the end in mind.
Mhm.
So the E standing for look for ways to enhance experiences for people at your companies respectively. The N for me would be find a way to be intentional in how you nurture culture. And then
Mhm.
the last thing for me would be make sure that you prioritize how you develop people. And if you start with the end in mind, there's not a doubt in my mind that one of two things will happen. Either the environment that you're in today will improve, or the second thing that you will be mindful of is that your time, talent, and treasure is no longer appreciated in the environment that you're in, and thusly you will switch the environment. So that would be my parting words for you.
That's great. The Christopher says flowers again. Soon you will have a garden, my friend.
I really appreciate that. We're all planting seeds, and Rochelle, thank you for planting a seed for all of us to talk about how diversity truly connects us. Like again, I can't thank you enough. I'm mindful of. I lost my grandmother earlier this year, and she did not have this type of opportunity. There was no spaces like this, especially in shared spaces in digital platforms. So thank you for you and the work that you're doing and the impact that you're making, and please continue to create oxygen for others the way that I know that you've created oxygen for me today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Oh, you're making me teary-eyed. Thank you so much for those parting words. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the platform today. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I want to thank you all for listening. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We share profound and courageous dialogues that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more and significant cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, hashtag diversity connects us.